Welcome
Great.
everyone to OTel in practice. Really stoked for such a good turnout. I think this is one of our best turnouts. Yay! And for anyone who couldn't make it today, there will be a recording. So if you have friends who are like, damn it, I missed this, you can let them know that we will be posting the recording and prettying it up once it's available. So Jacob presented I want to say last month for OTel Q&A. We worked together at Lightstep from ServiceNow. And I'll let Jacob take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Jacob Aronoff. I am a staff software engineer. I work on our telemetry pipeline team. Our team is sort of in charge of our internal and external open source telemetry efforts, whether it's like OTel SDKs in Go or the collector or the operator, sort of anything that you would be using to collect and send data to your vendor is what we do. So today I'm going to be talking about a migration that we led last year and a little bit year and a half ago for when we migrated from StatsD to OpenTelemetry and also from OpenTracing to OpenTelemetry. I'm going to talk about the various migration paths that are out there, some of the things that went well and went wrong for our migration. But I also would like this to be, feel free to ask as many questions as you have. My slides are pretty light, so I'm really interested to hear, where people struggle currently, what type of challenges you're running into, what features you're interested in. So please, raise a hand or, comment in the chat. And I'd be happy to answer any questions and go down any interesting avenues that you might have. So with that, I will share my screen. Can we all see my slides?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. So today I'll be talking about that OTel migration story. So first, let's talk about a problem. I've been in the industry for, many years. And I've had to lead a few of these migrations where your hand-rolled metrics or tracing or logging library just isn't cutting it anymore. Something where it's not performant enough. Maybe the maintenance is really expensive. Maybe there's a feature that everybody wants that you just can't implement. Whatever it might be, you want to do a migration. It can be very challenging and daunting, depending on the amount of services that your company runs, depending on what the organization's, willingness to undergo this migration might be. So all of these are problems that I've faced in various jobs, not just where I am now, but a few past roles as well. It can be really hard to make this happen, especially when you as maybe an SRE or a DevOps person, or maybe just a engineer, just want to make this work. When you feel very passionate about making it happen, and you just can't seem to get the buy-in that you need. So that is sort of the theme for today. And there is a solution, right? It's like migrating to this new thing. OTel's metric API. I'm going to be talking about metrics and traces, but this is really true about a lot of stuff. For OTel, the metrics API, the traces API, and even the logging API is accepted by most major vendors out of the box now. The API has support for all these instrument types in all of your favorite languages, probably. There are very few that don't. And the performance and compatibility is always top of mind for us throughout the stack of OTel components. Everybody is always thinking about performance. So, with all this in mind, you're like, yeah, this sounds great. I want to start using this. But there's a problem, right? Like using these new tools, migrating to these new tools is hard. How do you break up the work? How do you know all of your telemetry is working the same as before? What are the risks of these different migration models? What even are the different migration models? And probably the most important one here is how do you convince leadership that this is worth doing? You can try and, brute force your way into doing a migration, but that to me is a recipe for burnout. doing a migration in general where there's a new architecture that you think is really going to improve quality of life for your team, for your company, without getting organizational buy-in, is how you spend months in a project that may never see the light of day, and that is really demoralizing and very difficult to work around. So the first thing that you have to do when you want to migrate to a new tool is make the case. It's not even show a proof of concept. It's just, can you convince people that this is worth doing? Sometimes a proof of concept helps, but that's not the key to success. The key to success is really getting a group of people who agree with you that you're able to sell one-on-one, who can help you really make it clear to the stakeholders, in your leadership, that this is worth doing. For me, it's pretty straightforward. We're, a main OpenTelemetry contributor. The OTel API and SDK wanted to go into their, 1.0 stable, and they really wanted some quick feedback from someone who has a lot of traffic to test it out and see where the edges are. So in that case, it was very easy to sell the migration. In past jobs, the selling point is usually, you look at maintenance cost and performance overall. I worked with a hand-rolled solution a few jobs ago, and when it came time to do a migration, the thing that really sold people was just counting the amount of tickets and hours that we have to spend on new features and maintenance on our internal library, as well as the amount of times where we've had an incident because something related to our instrumentation is just incorrect, which does happen a lot with your own hand-rolled stuff. So that is maybe a good basis to go off of. Does anyone have any questions sort of before I go into more specifics about this section? And I'm going to do like a 5 count. Something I learned from a teacher of mine. We're going to do 5 seconds of silence until someone raises their hand, or I'll just keep going. So. No? Cool. Oh, is there something in the chat?
Oh, that's just me moving it along.
Oh, cool. No worries. Thank you. So let's talk about the migration paths. The first one is what I call the all or nothing. This method has you entirely rip out your existing instrumentation in favor of OTel. This would be, a lot of people talk about, replacing, the engine of a running plane or running car. That a lot of people will say that. This would be like, just getting a new plane and you have everyone hop to the new one while it's flying. So it's difficult, but maybe it has its benefits. One of the pros is that once you've pushed your code and you've confirmed things are working and you have a good enough CI/CD system, your work is really done, right? It just rolls out and everybody's happy. This reduces the time for split brain. Split brain is what happens when you're on 2 systems that may not be compatible together. You could imagine, if you're on StatsD or if you're on Prometheus even, if most of your metrics come from Prometheus, they don't have periods in them. They have, pretty strict requirements about their shape overall. You can't do things like up-down counters. Like that's not a type that they have. They used to not have a proper histogram. They now do. They now have an exponential histogram support, which is experimental. But there are things that OTel has that Prometheus or StatsD just does not have and doesn't have the ability to do. So being in a split brain where some services have it and some services don't, and they're emitting different metrics and different shapes, different variables, that can get pretty unwieldy pretty fast. And so if you're not very deliberate about planning how you're going to migrate your dashboards and alerts, then you're going to be stuck with both of them for some time, which if you're on call and if you've been on call during a migration for this type of stuff, that gets really painful. If you get paged at 3 a.m. and you have to wake up and go, oh, which dashboard should I check for this? Is this service on OTel or is this service on StatsD? That's really frustrating. That's the type of thing that you don't want to have an on-call engineer think about. So the other benefit of doing this all or nothing approach is that the issues are incredibly visible. If a dashboard breaks, if an alert pages or a service crashes, it's pretty obvious, right? Hopefully you're looking at a dashboard, or the person, you take the pager from when you're doing this migration so that you experience that pain. And hopefully you also page on no data. It's very important. And then service crashes, you should have an alert on that ideally. So all of these things, though, make it really clear that as soon as you do this all or nothing thing, if all of your services are rolling out within an hour with this new change and everything is looking good, that's a very good sign. And that gives a lot of confidence. This does, though, the clauses here, this requires a lot more thorough testing in a really good development environment. If you have a lot of environment drift where your staging environment is entirely different than your public environment, this might be really challenging, because this means you might have production bugs that you're just unable to catch in staging. And if the blast radius is all of your services, that can be really dangerous. Also, you do have those compatibility problems I mentioned. And so you have to be very deliberate about observing which dashboards and alerts break and fixing them proactively, or even in advance if you know what the metrics are going to be. The example I have here is definitely a common one, where you could imagine a metric type changes, but a metric name doesn't, which most vendors will just reject, or the dashboard that you're looking at will look very strange. This also does mean that there's more upfront effort to migrate your services. It's going to take, probably a group of people to help you monitor this, depending on how many services you have to migrate. If you're, a company with maybe 5 to 10 services, that's not too bad to do with one person. But if you're a company with hundreds of services, you're gonna want a team of people to monitor this with you. So on to the next one, we have the slow tail. This method gives your application developers the ability to migrate themselves by usually flipping an environment variable on and off for whichever method they want. Benefit here is that there's less upfront work. You can confirm that it works for one service and push it out for that service only, and you can do that in all of your environments. So if you have that, if you don't have that confidence that I mentioned earlier about your staging environment versus your production environment, this would be really helpful, because you could actually just push a single service without the fear of all these other services rolling out, to verify that your changes worked as expected. And finally, this also allows you to have more time to develop dashboards and alerts to handle those compatibility issues. Problem is that this can be very slow. If you have more than 50 services in at least 2 environments, and it takes an hour to migrate a single service because you're trying to be extra careful, then you're looking at a multiple weeks or months long process. If you leave a migration to app developers without a strong why, also, they'll never do it. So it's usually going to fall on your team to make that happen. Bugs also may not reveal themselves if your services are not uniform. Imagine you have something like a queue worker that works off of Kafka, whose topology looks entirely different than something like a classic API server. If you're only instrumenting your API servers, and then you go to instrument one of those Kafka servers, if there's something that's significantly different in how you did your instrumentation, that might take some time to figure out what's going wrong. Ideally, OTel has figured out a lot of this, but doing any of these migrations, you always need to check. We just cannot, and honestly should not, know how you instrument your services. You don't want to have to explain your whole observability backend to us. That doesn't really make much sense. So ultimately, it's important that you do some work to check that this migration is working as you expected. One thing that I did just think of is that you could do a combination of this slow tail all in one, where you do a migration for, say, some good sample of your services. And then once you're pretty confident with those, you could move to just enabling for everyone at once. That's another good option. I'm trying to think about the drawbacks of that. Not sure there are any. I think that's probably the way to go, unless you're really nervous about some of these compatibility problems or some of these like unknown unknowns. That might be the only time that would be a little scary. So the last one is the bridge. OpenTelemetry for some migrations actually provides a bridge where you can go from, instrumentation A to instrumentation B without having to do any real code changes other than implementing the bridge. There are a few issues here. Well, already you can see the pros. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? You don't have to make many code changes. Problem is that you're going to have some worse performance in comparison to writing using the new method. It's going to be, a fair, there's a conversion cost to anything that you're doing in your application. If another option is you could just send from, instrumentation A and then convert it to instrumentation B with the OTel collector. So if you wanted to go from stats D, the OTel collector has a stats D receiver and an OTel exporter. So that's also fine. But both of these have the same drawback, which is that if you wanted to take advantage of some of the capabilities of the OTel SDKs, then you're not really doing a migration. It means that you can, try and migrate stuff piecemeal and like for your dashboards and alerts, which is great. But it does have this drawback of like, you're not actually doing the migration. You're still, just putting off the hard work later. And so this can also be confusing to your app developers where someone says, well, my code says open tracing, but this trace says OTel. Why can't I, use X feature? And that can be a little confusing. I think that's like not the end of the world, though. It's as long as you're communicating well, that should be all right. But yeah, so this is I think using the collector is another really good path forward overall, though. Doing the thing where you just send some traffic to the collector from one of your services, you migrate your apps and dashboards, and then you have everything sent to the collector, and then you can migrate your apps to OTel with that all-in-one approach, and then your dashboards and alerts should just already be changed, and you should be all set. Before I move to the next portion, do I have any questions? Any thoughts? I'm going to do a 5 count.
One question, Jacob.
Yeah.
I'm actually living through this right now. One thing that I'm running into quite a bit is like getting the various developer teams to shift their mindset from sort of our previous vendor that we were with into our newer one. And it's, there's underlying things we're doing like the stats D into like a Prometheus style type thing with it. And yeah, that's led to a couple of people who are like, oh, these things aren't apples to apples here anymore. And that's causing a bunch of stuff. Any tips and suggestions on like winning the hearts and minds here?
Yeah, so really like the thing to do is sell on features when you can. So if you could say, this improves the easiest one is cost, right? If you're using StatsD, you're probably coming from Datadog. You're going to say, our previous spend with Datadog was X thousands, maybe millions of dollars. And with Prometheus, it's like, 100 a month or something, right? That's the easiest one. But the more valuable one is, you sell in the ecosystem where, for me, the real benefit of Prometheus is that the local development experience for metrics is actually much simpler. You don't have to run, a Datadog agent. You don't have to do anything else. You can just hit your metrics endpoint and verify that your metrics are doing what you expect them to. And that's a really good developer flow for testing that stuff. The other thing that is, I mean, people from Datadog, I used to work for Datadog, and their dashboards product is great. But Grafana, if you're using Grafana, also has a really strong dashboards product, and it's showing something like, maybe you use Redis in your kube cluster. You install a Redis service monitor, and then you install the off-the-shelf Grafana dashboard for it, right? Like that's a pretty great experience, and that's all done at zero cost to you, which is pretty incredible. Prometheus metric cost, which is very small, like cents on the dollar. So the last thing you can do is like trainings. I have a storied history with trainings. I think that they never really achieve the thing that you want, which is for more people to be excited.
Yeah.
Really what they do is they can cause more confusion if you're not careful with like your language. I think maybe a strategy that I've always wanted to do is like build some local tooling around this stuff to help developers. Whether it's, writing maybe an end-to-end test or a little UI around their applications metrics so that they can do something with them locally to be like, oh yes, like this thing is working as expected. I mean, I think that the local dev for Prometheus is just pretty fantastic.
Definitely.
And that's probably what I would sell on.
Okay.
But again, it's very company specific in many ways, right? If people are really bought into the Datadog model of things, which is, high cost, very low thinking, Prometheus and Grafana is not really that. It's low cost, but much more thinking. And ultimately, like, you don't want your developers to have to think too much about their instrumentation. The things that I tend to do is have a wrapper library before doing a migration, so that people are using the same signatures. It's just doing a different function under the hood. It also makes your migration easier. I didn't mention it here because most companies already have some type of wrapper because they have some needs that are like specific. It's usually like a thin wrapper, but doing as much as you can to not change their workflow and make it very simple is always going to be good. I think with Prometheus you can do is check what metrics are available, and then you can auto-generate dashboards from those metrics, and you can add into your Helm charts, these are the metrics I care about, and then you could just generate alerts automatically from that as well. So there's a lot of that quality of life stuff that, again, like, it's easy with the Datadog UI, but is automatic with infrastructure as code. So that's like another trade-off, I would say, because not a lot of people, I don't think, use Terraform with Datadog. So I don't know. Maybe they do, and I just don't know that.
Thanks for that, Chicken.
Yeah, no problem. Any more questions on this part? Cool. Okay. So now we'll talk about what I did, what the team did for our migration from StatsD to OTel, or metrics, obviously. So we began migrating using that slow tail path. The reasons were, I'd say, good motivating factors. As I mentioned earlier, the metrics API and SDK weren't declared stable at the time, which meant we would have had to deal with some signature changes. And that would have been potentially a lot of signatures. We did have a wrapper library, but still doing those types of changes can be pretty frustrating. We also wanted to use some new metrics features that StatsD didn't support. This is like asynchronous instruments. The biggest one was exponential histograms, which OTel sort of pioneered. And then the last one is that we would, because we are the group that helps write these libraries, we wanted to understand the performance and quality of life features to make it as easy as possible and as quick a decision. It's just, you don't have to worry about performance. You don't have to worry about all this other stuff. How do we make this simple? So in migrating to OTel for metrics, we did find a few performance issues. The first one was, because we were using that wrapper library I mentioned, our implementation was working off of open tracing tags, which at the time was our tracing instrumentation, which we then would need to convert into OTel tags anytime that you wanted to make a metric, which, if you think about the amount of times that you call, metric.record, that's a lot of times. So that gets pretty expensive. And so while we waited for improved performance in the metrics libraries, we just began our tracing migration because the OTel team needed time to investigate some of the stuff that we brought to them. And it also meant that we could fix, the very our company specific problem of this conversion. And so then we began our tracing migration, going from open tracing and open census to OTel. And so we went for this one with all or nothing approach because OTel for tracing had been stable for some time. weren't really concerned about compatibility. And ultimately, at the time, there weren't a lot of guides written. But the process was relatively straightforward, and the compiler is really doing most of the work for you. The structure for it, we already supported OTel traces in our product. So there was actually like in theory, there were no real functional changes either for our own dashboards and alerts that we were going off of. So what I did for this was write the code for the migration, and then build and push an image to our staging and production environments for a service that doesn't get much traffic. It does get some, it's important that it gets some. And then I confirmed that each version in our product looked the same before and after. We have a view of sort of, these red metrics per version, and it shows you the difference in those versions. And if any of those looked different, if the rate, for example, dropped off, then that's a sign that we did something totally incorrect. Doing that for one service is good, but then the reason that the all or nothing approach is really useful is that you get that integration test. So when I migrated all of our services to this new method, it was really clear that service to service trace propagation wasn't working. You just did a spot check of a few different traces, and that's like such an obvious thing. So that was a pretty easy fix. I actually had to just go into the OTel community and implement something that had a to-do around it. Another issue that we had right before, sort of in the last bit of this migration, was that our sampler wasn't configured correctly. OTel provides a lot of new features for sampling, and I was undersampling in one environment and then oversampling in another environment because I had misconfigured it. So I had to roll that back really quickly, fix it, and then push it out a day or two later. But overall, this whole process took maybe a month of work to migrate. I think it's like 100 or so services in all of our environments, which is, if you've ever led a migration, that's a pretty good time. I was pretty happy with that one. It also meant that we could get back to our metrics migration because we had sort of achieved that goal with open tracing tags. We were able to use the fact that we didn't need to do this conversion to continue our metrics migration. It also, we came back to the OTel team having shipped some real performance and quality of life improvements that really let us continue with this without the fear of performance problems. These changes also let us use this feature called metrics views, which let you create a new metric series to provide seamless compatibility with StatsD. StatsD emits their histogram is what's called a Prometheus summary. But we wanted to emit exponential histograms, but that's really the only change that was happening here. All of our other metrics were able to stay about the same. So we just needed to dual write the old summary, which OTel didn't really support at the time, and I think doesn't and shouldn't. It's a bad metric type. And we also wanted to dual write the exponential histogram so that we could migrate all of our dashboards and alerts from this old approach to this new approach. And then finally, as I said, we put this library behind a feature flag, and then we could just flip that on and off whenever we wanted. And then we would roll it out pretty slowly over a 2 or 3 month period to all of our environments. This also let us test the change really effectively as well. I think that's what's next. Let me go back. So any questions about this migration process? Do a 5 count again.
This is Rahul.
Hi.
I have one question around the OTLP protocol. So I'm guessing you must have used the OTLP receivers and exporters vastly during your metrics and trace migration. So what is the go-to protocol within OTLP? It supports HTTP and gRPC, but from security and performance point of view, which is the go-to protocol for traces and metrics?
I'm not sure I follow. We actually just emitted OTLP directly from our SDKs to our SaaS. So we didn't go through a collector for this one. We could have gone through a collector, but we didn't want the operational overhead at the time. It was enough migrations to handle at once. But that didn't really answer your question. Can you restate your question?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to know what is the best protocol to use under OTLP? Is it HTTP or gRPC? In terms of
Gotcha.
metrics and traces, yeah. In terms of performance and security.
Yeah, so I'm not the best for security recommendations. I would say we use gRPC for everything, just because it's, I don't know, our sort of de facto internal standard. HTTP is more accepted for some, like, depending on your company's security requirements. I'm not sure of the real differences, like to compare and contrast them. I don't think I'd be the right person to speak to those. Maybe some of the other OTel folks have more of an opinion or more information on that, though.
Yep, yeah, sounds good.
Okay, cool.
And were there any learnings around managing access tokens? And did you use multiple access tokens? Does it throttle, if you're sending a lot of metrics or traces over a single access token?
Yeah, we just used the same access token approach that we did, where I don't know if I can speak to that just because it's internal security stuff.
Got it.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
I'd say that the best thing you can do for security in like a cloud native environment is use some sort of secrets provider. The Kubernetes external secrets operator is great. You can hook it up to something like GCP's KMS and decrypt and version your secrets to then load access tokens from, though. You can do the same thing with AWS or Vault or any of these other providers as well. If you're particularly like security inclined, it's also important to use things like MTLS as well. Something like Istio can help you with some of that. The OTel operator actually provides some MTLS features in OpenShift. So there are a lot of security features out there to be used. Hopefully that seeds some interesting investigation for you.
Yep. Thanks.
No problem. So moving on, you might be wondering what's next. Are we going to do a logs migration? And right now we're under a different migration, which is changing our infrastructure metrics to use the OTel first receivers, like the kube cluster receiver, the kubelet receiver, and so forth. Because we really want to start using some of these things that the community is writing. After that, we should be able to begin migrating to use the new OTel logging SDKs, which should be looking pretty good. And they're looking good now, but I'm not sure what the state of it is for Go just yet, given that Go just released like a new standard logging library. Yeah. Any more questions?
Hi, this is Jay speaking. I have one general question regarding OpenTelemetry. So I'm pretty new to this, new to OpenTelemetry, and the reason why I was investigating into OpenTelemetry was for its ability to be backend agnostic for generating metric data. The question is, however, I was interested in exploring pull-based metrics exporters, but so far, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but the Prometheus exporter within the OpenTelemetry SDK is the only one that is supporting the pull-based metrics approach. Is that correct?
So it sounds like you're going. So there are a few different types of exporters within OTel. So there's an SDK exporter, which there's a Prometheus exporter. I think there might even be a StatsD exporter. But what might be a better fit is to use the OTel collector and use their exporters, which are numerous, and pretty much every backend has some type of exporter. So I think I would try and say you should, if you're going to use OTel SDKs, you should export an OTLP to an OTel collector and then export to your protocol of choice.
Yeah, but when using this OTel exporter, this would rather be a push-based mechanism, right? To send data to the OTel collector.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
You can also, if your instrumentation is in Prometheus right now, though, you can have the OTel collector scrape the Prometheus metrics and then export them as OTLP or export them as StatsD or whatever you want.
Good. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Jacob, do you use any solution to manage or update the YAML file of the fleet of agent fleet on the go? I mean, is there any built-in solution that you guys are using to manage the collectors?
Yeah, so I am a maintainer for the OTel operator, and internally and externally, I recommend using the OTel operator with the OTel collector CRDs. They're pretty easy to use, easy to set up, easy to manage, and we're always developing and thinking about new features as well. And so that'll be the place to get those now and in the future, and I'd continue recommending that.
Okay, thanks.
Jacob, could I ask a question following on from the last question? Would you recommend using something like OPAMP in terms of managing your fleet of collectors, or would you say it's preferable to do it on an operator basis, kind of kube pattern?
Yeah, so if you're in Kubernetes, OPAMP, by the way, is still pretty early alpha right now. The protocol itself is stable, but the actual implementations are in alpha. So I'm going to answer this question with the assumption that the implementations are done, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah.
So if you're in Kubernetes, I would recommend using the OPAMP bridge that we're developing. The bridge is a component that can connect to your vendor and will be able to manage pools of collectors rather than just having an extension that works on, or a supervisor and an extension that works on a single collector pod. The reason for that is usually you are running a collector and when you're running a collector in a pool, not as a monolith. And so whereas OPAMP on using a supervisor would be very useful for a VM or just running it as a binary. Doing it in Kubernetes, if you're running it as a pool, it's not a great pattern in Kubernetes to have a supervisor update a single pod's configuration to make it not uniform with the other pods in its replica set. So what that means is, if you're going to run it in Kubernetes, if you're going to run a replica set of pods in Kubernetes, you want those pods to be the same configuration. And if you're only running a supervisor, or if you're running a supervisor on each of those pods, but you're only making the change to a single one, that's an anti-pattern and can get you into some trouble. So the bridge, however, can manage pools of collectors and is definitely what I would recommend to use. Again, with this stuff being completed, that's what I would recommend for Kubernetes.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I've got a few questions related to the work. So I work at a large US bank and I'm trying to bring in OTel and essentially have that as our main strategy to try and move away from bets on vendors specifically. The question that we're running into just now are the challenges like vanilla versus vendor. And what I mean by that is, do we just pull down, if I take the collector, for example, do we just pull down the collector, configure the collector the way that we want it with receivers and exporters, or with the strategic vendors that we work with? Do we look to bring their vendor wrapped collector and deploy that within our enterprise? There's obviously pros and cons in doing both. It doesn't sound like, from your side, Jacob, obviously you're working from the vendor side, but I have spoken to other vendors who have given me an interesting range of opinions on what area or which of those to look at. It'd be quite interesting to see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, this is a great, really great question. It totally depends on your deployment model, I would say. So one option, especially, if you're running thousands of pods and, hundreds of clusters, the model that I would recommend you use is the gateway model, where, let's say you have a collector per group of apps, and then all of those collectors forward to a centralized pool of collectors that then forward to your vendor. This means that those pools for your applications are vendor neutral, because all they're really doing is gathering and forwarding stuff for your application teams, and then a centralized team would manage the gateway collectors, and then that's the place where you make the decision about, am I going to use my vendor's wrapped collector, or am I going to use my vendor neutral one? The choice becomes really easy to, if there's some feature that your vendor provides that's only available in the wraps collector, you could choose to use the wrapped collector there, and then in the future, if you wanted to change vendors, you still have OTLP data sending to that vendor collector, and so you can just change that one out very, very easily. The reason that this is good is because you wouldn't have to go to your application teams or any of these other orgs and say, hey, you have to reconfigure your whole setup because we're changing our underlying vendor here. Whereas you, as the centralized team, could be the one to just change a single pool to make it all consistent. That's probably that's like a pretty future-proofed approach. The configuration for what you're going to do, no matter what, is going to be complicated. But that one is probably going to do you best if you really want to use the vendor's collector. If not, still doing the gateway approach is a pretty good one. You can centralize things like obfuscation, sampling rates, or even requirements for telemetry. Things like attribute requirements can be centralized before they can egress. It also means you can have set points of egress as well, which if you're in a pretty locked down Kubernetes cluster, as is really important to have only a certain amount of applications that can egress from the cluster.
Okay, I think I definitely follow in terms of the deployment patterns and layouts and having the multiple levels of collector. I think that's where we are thinking and going. I think for me, being in the enterprise, what we are worried about is, again, moving stuff like this to production. So if we have a theoretical issue in a vanilla collector, again, just theoretical example, if we've got RTOs and we've got to fix issues within 1 or 2 hours, for example, that's probably going to be the tipping point for us on the vendor versus vanilla question. Because we would obviously be looking for some kind of support from a vendor, and typically we would have that as most folks would have through a vendor. But then it certainly in my mind gives us another problem where instead of going from agent proliferation, where you are just now, it's almost like going to OTel proliferation. It's almost like you're solving one problem and creating another. So I think like the others on the call, we're relatively early in our journey, and we're just trying to go through not necessarily the technical questions, but the hardening questions. What would reality look like when we're in production with very high volumes of traffic coming through?
Yeah, I mean it sounds like you're on the right path here overall, as far as your thinking is going. There definitely is that worry of like collector proliferation. You can avoid that, multiple pools to gateways if you'd like. If you're going from, usually you're doing this if you're going from like a legacy protocol, something like StatsD, which doesn't like to go over the internet because it's UDP. Or something like Prometheus, where you have all of these targets and you don't want to worry about managing the scrapes for them, right? Doing this at scale is going to be really environment and volume dependent. I think if your vendor provides their own collector, they should be able to give you some support for, the vanilla collectors that you run. With the people that I work with, do give support for whatever collectors they run. And we don't have a vendor specific collector. Our company just doesn't give out a vendor specific one. But I provide support for any collectors that a customer runs. So if that's the fear, I would check with your vendor to see that they also will give you that type of support. I also have found that like the steady state of these things is pretty, once you tune it with resourcing and auto scaling, it's pretty hands off, I've found. I actually was just working yesterday in a cluster that I touch every 6 months or so to do some like Helm chart testing. And it's been running for 6 months without issue, and with like a huge varying scale of traffic because of auto scaling and sort of just because of how simple I keep those collectors. This is for both metrics and traces too, for infrastructure and application. So, it's a much smaller example than what you're talking about for sure. But the point remains where it's like once you reach a good steady state, especially with like the biurnal cycle, if that's what you have, if your auto scaling is set up correctly and if your configuration is pretty nailed down, it should be pretty hands off. Knock on wood, but that's definitely the hope.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jacob. Appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
So folks, we are coming up on time. So we've got about 5 more minutes in case anyone has any more burning questions for Jacob. Alrighty, I will take that as a no. But thank you, Jacob, so much for joining today and sharing your migration story. I think this has resonated with a lot of folks. So we definitely appreciate you coming on and sharing this experience with everyone. Like I said, this recording will be made available on the OTel YouTube channel. Also, for anyone who has missed Jacob's OTel Q&A session that we had last month, there is a video up on the OTel channel. And Reese, who works with Rin and me on the OTel and user working group, did a wonderful write-up of the Q&A in case video isn't your jam. So definitely be sure to check that out. Okay, so if you go to this link here, you should be able to find our various Slack channels, and we encourage everyone to just ask questions, share use cases. We love hearing all that stuff. And also, if you or anyone you know has a really cool OTel use case, you're just getting started, or you're a more advanced user, it does not matter. We would love to hear from you. We're always looking for folks for OTel in practice, OTel Q&A, and we also have monthly OTel end user discussions, which we run those for 3 different time zones. So we have them for EMEA, APAC, and Americas. So be sure to join any one of those because there's always really amazing and thoughtful discussions coming out of these. So yeah. everyone, thank you very much. And once again, Jacob, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us twice.
Yeah,
Always
thank
happy to. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks,
All right,
Jacob.
everyone.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye now.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye.